Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll find out what new weapons the Navy wants to put on its destroyers, look at the newest Air Force Special Operations Unit, and go inside a U.S. Navy P-8 at the Paris Air Show. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis. This is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin. This week we've got a bunch of different stories to show you, ranging from going inside a P-8 aircraft to looking at how future European fighters could work. We'll also profile the Military Times Coast Guardsman of the Year. But before we get to that, here's some headlines. Up first, the Boeing and Saab TX trainer has completed its first engineering and manufacturing development, or EMD, flight from Boeing's St. Louis facility. The TX, which Boeing won the contract for last year, is set to replace the Air Force's 1960s-era T-38 trainers and will enter service in the 2020s. The EMD phase is used to develop the aircraft and get it ready for a Milestone C decision, which would start low-rate production by both Boeing and at Saab's future facility in Indiana. And according to the head of Naval Sea Systems Command, U.S. Navy engineers are considering installing upgraded launchers on the Arleigh Burke class of destroyers, with the service hoping to keep the ships in service longer than planned. New launchers may be next in the works in order to keep pace for the need for hypersonic weapons. The Navy's current strike missile, the Harpoon, is a subsonic weapon that's vulnerable to advanced Russian and Chinese air defenses, and putting such hypersonic systems on surface ships would greatly increase their strike capabilities. And in a surprise, KARAM Aircraft is paired up with Northrop Grumman and Raytheon to forge an unlikely team for the Army's Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft, or FARA, which would replace OH-58D Kiowa Warrior helicopters. The overall design is due in early 2020, and though the details are few on how each company will specifically contribute to the final product, the KARAM Northrop Raytheon team now competes against 4 other major bids, although only 2 will advance to build a viable prototype. The FARA program is part of the Army's Future Vertical Lift effort, which is one of the service's top priorities. And out in Japan, the U.S. Air Force has stood up a Pacific-based CV-22 Osprey unit, stationing it at Yokota Air Base outside Tokyo. The unit, the 21st Special Operations Squadron, will be joined by the 753rd Special Operations Aircraft Maintenance Squadron and replaces a detachment of Ospreys that have been at Yokota for some time. According to the commander of the 21st Squadron, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Hawk, the goal is to have 10 Ospreys and about 450 airmen assigned to Yokota under the 2 units, which will report to the 353rd Special Operations Group on Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. And according to an Army press release, infantry soldiers are getting closer to a hands-on test of the Mobile Protected Firepower vehicles. 2 vendors for the MPF were chosen last December, BAE and General Dynamics, and beginning next March, prototypes will undergo assessments that include being tested out by the 82nd Airborne Division. Those light tanks are necessary to help units blast through obstacles that traditionally slow infantry down and maneuver through areas less accessible to larger, heavier tanks such as the M1 Abrams. After the hands-on testing and soldier input, 1 vendor will be chosen to produce the vehicle in fiscal year 2022. And F-35 pilots from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Israel took part in a training exercise together over the Eastern Mediterranean Sea last week. The first such exercise now that all 3 nations have used the 5th-generation jets in combat. Flying out of separate bases located in the UAE, Cyprus, and Israel, the exercise provided pilots the chance to work on capability and operations while simulating realistic combat. The F-35s acted as friendly forces going against 4th-generation aircraft during the defensive counter-air exercise. And for the first time in 19 months, a U.S. Navy Littoral Combat Ship is deployed as the USS Montgomery arrived in the Philippines this past week. The reason this is significant is because the last LCS deployment by the USS Coronado ran from June 2016 to December 2017, and since then, maintenance problems and a major reorganization have kept the LCS fleet from deploying. And the Air Force has planned to use an Airborne Battle Management System, networked across many aircraft, drones, and satellites. It's one of the most ambitious and unique acquisition programs in the entire Department of Defense. So to get an update, Valerie and Senna talked with the Air Force's acquisition chief, Dr. Will Roper. Here's what he had to say.
We've made great progress since we've hired our chief architect, Preston Dunlap, and the Air Force has done a great job of rallying around him. ABMS and multi-domain command and control is a top priority for our Chief of Staff, General Goldfein. And so he made it clear we've got to get ABMS over the goal line. And the Air Force Warfighter Integration Center that works for the Chief to try to pull in operational concepts across the Air Force so that we're putting together an architecture at the Air Force level, has really embraced Preston and given good thoughts about how ABMS needs to work. The rule that we're using on ABMS is we don't start talking platforms till the end. And that's probably going to be biblical for us for the first few years of the program. It is so easy to start talking about satellites and airplanes and forget what ABMS is going to have to uniquely champion, and that's the data architecture that will connect them. So Preston's done a great job of starting to write down the requirements for our data architecture, leveraging a lot of work that's already underway in our space development portfolio. There's an initiative no one's heard of called Unified Data Library. It's not a very exciting name. It's like Castle Anthrax from Monty Python, but it's super awesome. Unified Data Library is used currently for space situational awareness. Data pipes in from a variety of sources, commercial, academic, government. It's able to be addressed at multiple layers of classification, and we do microservices on top of it that are used by different users. And so you can look at UDL, Unified Data Library, and talk about doing space situational awareness without talking about a single sensor that's doing it. You can talk about a data architecture that's populated, distributed for microservices, and ABMS will look like that. We will have data coming in from satellites, from UAVs, maybe from terrestrial, and we'll have to have microservices written on top of it to do command and control. That'll be the software component. So step one, the thing we've got to get right during the first year of ABMS is that data architecture, because people need to build systems that populate according to whatever standards we fix. Step two, once we get the data architecture defined, will be the requirements for the population of the data. So maybe one sensor needs to be able to fill a gap that others are creating. So we're going to have to look at requirements at the system level and then tell satellites you need to be able to provide this level of data at this refresh rate. UAVs, you need to be able to do this rate, and so on and so forth. Once we do that, then we'll be into the traditional part of the acquisition, which is building those satellites, building those UAVs. So the thing I'm excited about is we just talked about doing ABMS, Advanced Battle Management, but what we just discussed has application to battle management, but you could apply it to any mission. Right? We could do ISR this way. We could do intelligence gathering this way. So I think if we get this right, the data architecture approach for ABMS is something we'll lift and shift to other missions and really create something that feels more like an internet type effect in the Air Force. And what I've told Preston, we've got to do demonstrations along the way. So I expect to do yearly demonstrations, but the first one we want to get to is ad hoc mesh networking, so that we get the same kind of Internet of Things effect where things start working together without humans having to control them, and to not wait for the full architecture to be fielded. And it really will never be done. ABMS will emerge over time as we put up more satellites and UAVs. More things connecting to the network will make the system of systems better. So ABMS will emerge. Well, if it's going to emerge, it needs to emerge based on principles, and those principles should be demonstrated prior to getting to the goal line that's a long way away. So I think by the time we get to our 21 budget, ABMS should be well definitized in terms of the lines of effort for data architecture. We know we'll have to have a line for artificial intelligence because we were not going to be able to pass all the data collected across the networks, a networking component, and then at the end, the platforms that provide it. But the chief says it best, this has got to be about the highway, not the trucks that are on it. So step one is getting the highway paved. I know that we're going to have to incentivize openness at the digital level. So software openness, not just hardware openness, that we have a few good initiatives doing today, but not nearly enough. To your point, openness in the Internet of Things makes sense because you can monetize the data, and that's not going to exist for us. So we're going to have a contracting incentive that replicates it. The best theory we have now is some kind of royalty scheme that the more open you are and the more adaptation we do on top of your system, the more you benefit from it. So if you create the system that allows us to put 100 apps on top of it, you benefit differently than if we can only put one. But the details are going to be difficult because maybe that one app is super important. So we've brought in industry early, and we plan to have a series of industry days where we talk about what does it take to create that structure. Industry appears interested because if we can build open, yes, there has to be a way to give them profit and cash flow, but it gives them more opportunities to bring new technologies in. But if we can't replicate profit and cash flow on which their quarterlies depend, then they're going to have to go back to the old model of saying they're for open, but secretly giving you closed. So I don't have the answer on this. I just know that without that incentive, I don't expect new behavior.
So what are the immediate next steps for this program?
So, with the money that we have this year, we're able to get this kind of data architecture, analysis, and demonstration work done. The bigger money for ABMS really begins in 20 and 21. That's where we'll ramp up fuller scale prototyping. So I'm actually glad that we don't have big money this year because we can't go build a drone or a satellite. So we've got to focus on the part that's less sexy, which is that data architecture, data lake, microservice structure. We're going to have to be able to do software development at multiple levels of classification and do it securely. All those are things that are hard to get people energized about, but they're going to be the makes or breaks for this program.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. And when we come back, we're going to go inside a U.S. Navy P-8 aircraft. The P-8 is one of the Navy's newest toys, designed for maritime surveillance and anti-submarine warfare. So at the Paris Air Show, Executive Editor Jill Itoro got the opportunity to give us an inside tour.
We're here in the P-8 Poseidon, which is the Navy's maritime aircraft focused primarily on anti-submarine warfare. They also do some search and rescue, which some might have seen during hurricane season, which is also interesting. The airframe of this aircraft is based on the Boeing 737 commercial aircraft, which explains just the sheer mass inside as well as outside of the P-8. So some interesting information on this is the Navy right now is in contract with Boeing for about 117 aircraft. They told Reuters recently that they're probably going to end up upping that by another 21 aircraft, which would keep them in production until about 2025. Boeing shares maintenance of the airframe with AAR. The two companies compete every year for a share of that workload. First year, the majority was done by Boeing. They just awarded the second year, majority is going to be done by AAR. In terms of the kind of weaponry you have on here, they drop the sonobuoys is basically how this functions. In terms of the weapons, there's harpoons, there's torpedoes, and we have 3 different sections within the aircraft for managing that. We have someone that's looking on the surface in terms of the environment during an operation. There's someone that's checking underwater in terms of the sonar that's happening that they can get from the sonobuoys. That data then is transferred to someone that puts all of the data together, figures out how it's functioning, what they need to know based on the mission, and will decide what kind of weaponry might be needed and how to proceed, and they transfer that data to the pilot who can control the actual unloading of weapons as needed for a given mission. Interesting point here also is that this is the same airframe that Boeing had planned to use for the JSTARS recapitalization program for the Air Force, which was going to provide ISR capabilities and replace a legacy aircraft from Northrop. That program was, of course, scrapped last year and is no longer happening. From inside the P-8, I'm Jill Itoro, Defense News.
One big question at the Paris Air Show was how a future Franco-German fighter will be built at a time when the defense industrial base is shaky both in Europe and across the world. Our European editor, Sebastian Springer, got the chance to address that with the head of the European Defense Agency. Take a look.
It's quite possible that the FCAS program by Spain and Germany and France and the British Tempest program will lead to such a situation. What's your assessment?
Well, we have to see, but I first of all, we should look at FCAS is not going to be a just one platform. It's going to be a system of systems. So it will be a very complex program. It will take many years. I think it will be very important for it to be sustainable. It has the economies of scale which are necessary. And at the same time as we have these 3 initial member states signing up to it, but I do not exclude that this will bring on board other member states as we go along. So what will happen with the Tempest project, I cannot say at this point in time.
But you, as the person who oversees it, you would like to see some type of convergence, I'm sure.
I think in Europe we will probably have to see a convergence towards having a single system of systems. I mean, but as I underline, it's not an issue of platform. And as always, consolidation and thinking of the competitiveness of the European defense industry, we have to think if a program is sustainable. Is the next generation sustainable, next generation of combat aircraft sustainable with several systems in Europe? Mm-hmm. I have my doubts.
Yeah. And speaking of consolidation, there have been calls to consolidate the defense industry as such also. What is the level of urgency you see for that?
Well, I think the urgency is there. In the next 5 to 10 years, the defense industry is going to know a real revolution technologically, which is going to change the nature of it. Also, the innovative and disruptive technologies are going to change a lot the way we do business in defense. So that is going to have an impact on the defense industry in itself. But apart from that, I think that the only way forward in defense in general, not only for defense industry, is defense cooperation. Defense cooperation will be the only way that Europe will remain a credible partner in operational terms, but also in technological and industrial terms. And that requires that we pool together to do as many defense cooperation projects in the future. And the consolidation of the industry will happen around those cooperative endeavors.
One of the most challenging parts of that FCAS program, though, is set to be the networking. And that's being taken on by a German coalition led by Hensoldt. At the Paris Air Show, Sebastian Springer visited them to see what they had to say.
After politicians did their part to move the FCAS program forward, it's now time for industry to take the next step. German companies are expected to sign a consortium agreement here at the Paris Air Show, led by Hensoldt, to describe what the division of labor will be. We caught up with some of their executives to explain to us what's in store.
Well, in Germany, if we look at the electronics area, the area in which we are active as Hensoldt, you have many different players. So what we thought in Germany, it would be important to actually put all those players together and form a consortium that can deliver and then talk directly also to the relevant French partners, in this case for the sensors, effectors, mission system towards Thales as well. Obviously always in cooperation with the both platform OEMs, Dassault and Airbus.
As the FCAS program gets underway, what role do you think Hensoldt can contribute in it?
Hensoldt basically is involved in various areas for such an integrated air system, like integrated mission systems, but also the sensors, passive sensors and active sensors like multifunctional radar. And I assume that we are going to take an important role into all of these aspects.
And because the aircraft, the platform is so far away in the future, what do you think will be the important elements from a spectrum dominance perspective that will have to be considered?
I think from a spectrum dominance perspective, basically, it is very important to get situational awareness, what's going on in the spectrum, who is communicating with whom, where are the threats located, and this is particularly critical because these days and in the future even more important is that we have a very high occupance of the electromagnetic spectrum by civil communications, like satellite communications, like mobile communication, and so on and so forth. And if you don't have very advanced spectrum dominance technology, you will not know what is going on in the spectrum, who is the threat, where is the threat, and what is it doing to you.
How important do you think stealth capabilities will be for future aircraft, such as the FCAS?
I think in the future, stealth will be certainly remain as an important element. But the importance is nevertheless diminishing because these days, we have radar technology which operates in a very low frequency area that is able to detect such aircraft like fighter aircraft. And also the passive radar technology using TV stations and radio stations for transmission they are also able to detect such aircraft. But for a system of systems like FCAS, there will certainly be important to have such a stealth element in the system of systems.
Thank you.
Stay tuned, because when we come back, we're going to take a look at the Military Times Coast Guardsman of the Year. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal expert Carrie Sepulveda offers her latest tips.
Building strong credit is arguably one of the most important things you can do for your financial and personal goals. You might be thinking, you need a good credit score to get the loan, but you can't get the loan because you don't have a good credit score or a score at all. Seems like a catch-22, right? Fortunately, there are tools out there that can help. Secured cards are a great way to establish credit for the first time. They're a little different than an unsecured card, as secured cards are funded by you, the cardholder. So instead of a bank or a credit union extending a line of credit, you fund a deposit that's used as your credit line, reducing the risk for the financial institution. Consider it boot camp to building credit. Like a normal credit card, your activity will be reported to the credit bureaus, giving you credit where credit is due. Always pay your bills on time, and if possible, try paying the balance in full. If managed properly, some financial institutions will upgrade you to an unsecured card. Building credit doesn't happen overnight. Stay committed, just like you did at boot camp. You should graduate in no time.
Thanks, Carrie. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our early bird brief. It's delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And when we come back, we're going to take a look at the Military Times Coast Guardsman of the Year. Every year, Military Times recognizes one member of each of the armed services for their outstanding performance and contributions to the nation at an event here in Washington. Here's a look at this year's honoree from the Coast Guard.
The Bay, to me, it looks like God's country. Some days it lets you know who the boss is. Some days it's the most rewarding job on the water. My family have always worked on the water. Chart number 12221 literally defines what I grew up on. It's the lower Chesapeake Bay and the seaside of the Eastern Shore, and that is my life.
I'm William Reynolds, retired Coast Guard, 26 years, Senior Chief Bosun Mate, and I'm Nathan Reynolds' father. I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a lot of time with him after I got out of the Coast Guard. His teen years were spent with me on the water. We've been out in some bad situations at night with a lot of wind, a lot of sea. That sort of thing doesn't faze him.
I grew up on the lower Chesapeake Bay, and I was able to see the many things that can go wrong out there on the water. I chose to go in the Coast Guard because the Coast Guard's a life-saving service. I chose because it's one of the things that I feel like I can make a difference in my background being on the water. That evening, it was forecasted to pick up. It was a small craft advisory, and we got a phone call about a vessel taking on water, and they had 3 feet of water on deck. They lost radio contact. Once they did that, it was bad news. Normally means that they lose power or the vessel's gone down. We arrived on scene from the last known position, and there was nothing to be found. It was eerie because the wind was picking up, and I knew we weren't going to have a lot of time.
He did his initial search pattern. He asked for further instructions from sector. They had their hands full. He wasn't satisfied waiting. He knew it was a dire situation. He took all the data that he had, laid out his own search pattern, told his crew what he was doing, went right back on the search.
The second leg, I made that right-hand 90-degree turn, and that's when we heard them. They were yelling and screaming. All 4 persons were there floating together. They had a life ring, and they also had a chair they held with them. I guess that was the only 2 things that they had when the boat went down. The actions of my crew most definitely saved their lives. If I had a choice, I'd work on the Chesapeake Bay for the rest of my life.
When you look at him, when he's standing at the wheel and he's out here doing his thing, he is a part of the Chesapeake Bay. He's a waterman first and foremost, and I'm proud of that.
You can go out and run boats and save lives, and you can do a lot of things. It's the attention to detail that makes a difference. It's the little things that make a difference. It's the little things that bring everybody home safe. It's those things that make a big difference when it comes to completing the mission successfully. My dad's taught me everything. Everything.
It's nice for me to be able to pass on to him what was passed on to me from my father. And what I hope he gets to do is pass that on himself.
That's all we have time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.